Welcome to OT 508, the Pentateuch, taught at the Blue Ridge Institute in Roanoke, Virginia. This is Class 2. In Class 1, we examined Israel's prehistory, recorded for us in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, from the creation of the world through the Tower of Babel, and then Israel's history, found in the narrative portions of the Pentateuch, beginning with Abram in Genesis 12, on through the first 18 chapters of the book of Exodus, and then jumping ahead to Numbers chapters 10 through 33. In this particular lecture, Lecture 2, we will be considering Israel's ceremony, meaning that we will be looking at the description of Israel's cultic worship and the celebrations found in Exodus 19, Exodus 24 through 40, the whole book of Leviticus, and the first 9 chapters of the book of Numbers. Although there are a few chapters in Exodus and Leviticus, like Exodus 19 through 23 and Leviticus 18 to 20, that will be covered in our third lecture concerning Israel's covenant with God. But in this lecture, our focus is on the ceremonies of Israel's worship of God. Of course, all of Israel's worship is really a response to the salvation of God and a response to the covenant of God. Israel worshipped because God had delivered Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Israel worshipped God specifically the way that God deemed in the covenant that he should be worshipped. Israel did not invent their own worship, but received it as part of the covenant from God. So really, we should consider Israel's covenant with God before Israel's worship, since worship did not lead to the covenant, but the covenant led to worship. However, structurally within the Pentateuch, while the covenant is laid out in some detail from chapters 19 through chapter 23 in Exodus, the greatest detail in the covenant is found in the book of Deuteronomy, which is why we have saved covenant for Lecture 3 and dealt with ceremony here in Lecture 2. So that we cover Exodus and Leviticus and parts of Numbers in this lecture and save Deuteronomy and the covenant for Lecture 3. As we begin considering Israel's ceremonies, it is possible to divide even this portion of the class up into 3 additional sections. There is first a large focus on the place of Israel's worship, the tabernacle, including what is in the tabernacle, such as the furniture. This is especially evident in Exodus chapters 24 up through chapter 40. There is then, secondly, and perhaps most famously, a large focus upon Israel's sacrificial system and festivals, seen in great detail in the beginning of Leviticus and parts of the book of Numbers. And then third, and last but not least, we have a focus upon the ones who are organizing, directing, and leading Israel's cultic ceremony, Israel's priests and Levites, who are highlighted throughout the Pentateuch, following Exodus chapter 32 and the golden calf, but are most clearly discussed in the book that bears their name in English, Leviticus, as well as the first 9 chapters of Numbers. Thus we have, as it were, under the heading of Israel's ceremonies, a 3-pronged focus upon the place, the performance, and the performers of Israel's worship. In Exodus chapter 19, Israel arrives at Mount Sinai. We have no idea where Mount Sinai is located, although many suggestions have still been made, in southern Arabia, northern Arabia. The name Sinai comes from the term for a small shrub or bush, which doesn't really narrow down the search any. Although really it doesn't matter where Mount Sinai is, because the theological emphasis of the tabernacle, the cloud, the pillar of fire, is that God does not actually live on Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is now Mount Olympus. If anything, Mount Zaphon, literally the mountain of the north, found in Psalm 48 verse 2 and elsewhere, Mount Zaphon is occasionally referred to as God's ancient holy mountain, at least until Mount Zion. In the meantime, Mount Sinai is temporarily God's holy mountain, but not permanently. This is just where God has elected to meet with Israel. God journeyed with Israel from Egypt in the form of the cloud and the pillar of fire, so clearly Israel was not traveling to Mount Sinai to meet God at his permanent home, because God was already with Israel. Additionally, according to Exodus 19, when Israel arrives at Mount Sinai, God's cloud that led Israel through the wilderness is no longer mentioned. It may have gone up on the mountain when Israel stopped to camp, the text doesn't say, but the text does say that it's 2 more days. It's not until the 3rd day that God actually comes to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is not the permanent mountain of God, because God's not there when they first arrive. It is actually just where God will meet with Israel, as God promised Moses at the burning bush. Of course, if we knew which mountain was Mount Sinai, I guarantee there would be a shrine built on it by humans in an idolatrous form of worship, which would miss the point of Mount Sinai altogether. Mount Sinai is the meeting place between God and Israel. It is a mountain that is reflective of other mountains that we see in the Old Testament where God meets with Israel. God meets even with his people, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden. God meets with his people in a portable mountain, so to speak, which is what we have in the tabernacle, and eventually on Mount Zion. The ceremony of Israel's worship is established here at Mount Sinai. The covenant with Israel is established here at Mount Sinai. And then Israel is ready to leave this meeting place to move to the Promised Land. And really, Mount Sinai is a precursor to the Promised Land. It's holy ground, as set forth in Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush, which eventually in Joshua 6 we see all of Israel, all of the Promised Land, declared to be Promised Land, declared to be holy ground. Because as Exodus 19 makes clear, all of Israel is a kingdom of priests. All of Israel will be the dwelling place of God, with Israel worshiping God in their midst. But Exodus 19 also teaches Israel that God is a consuming fire, that his presence, which guided Israel in the wilderness as a veiled pillar of fire, viewed by day as a cloud, really a fire that is veiled with the cloud, the glory of God being veiled from their sight, but seen at night in the dark as the fire that is burning brightly in the midst of that cloud. Exodus 19 really takes that image of a cloud and fire and amplifies it greatly, describing the cloud of God's glory descending upon the mountain in great thunder and lightning and fire and smoke, a terrifying theophany, a terrifying appearance of God accompanied with earthquakes, not a volcanic eruption with lava flowing down the mountain, as some scholars have suggested. It's a great image, just not one Israel would have understood. But they would have understood the idea of a massive storm descending upon the mountain. Many of the gods of the ancient Near East were considered to be storm gods, gods of thunder, like Baal of the Phoenicians that we discover under Ahab and Jezebel in the book of Kings. Baal, most properly known as Hadad, the god of thunder. But Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the greatest storm god, the great God of thunder, whose voice is like thunder and shakes the mountains so that they dance. This God is awesome and terrifying and holy. He continually warns that no one should approach the mountain of God. No one is worthy to come near. Who may approach the mountain of God? Who can ascend the hill of the Lord? Well, no one. No one is allowed to come near. And even when they do come near, they are told to prepare themselves. For 2 days, 3 days, they are told to prepare themselves, to make themselves holy. They are even warned by Moses in Exodus 19 to stay away from their wives sexually, which has led one scholar to argue that maybe Moses thought that only men would eventually meet with God at the base of the mountain. But really men, women, children, they will all meet with God at the base of the mountain, but again, not ascending the mountain of God. They're not allowed to go up on the mountain. They have to prepare themselves even to come near a little bit to the base of the mountain. And when they come near, they are terrified. And when they hear God thunder, God speak, they are terrified, to the point that they ask God in Exodus chapter 20 to allow Moses to speak with God, and then for Moses to give them the message, because they cannot stand the voice of God because of how terrifying it is. Exodus 19 also mentions the sound of a ram's horn, which indicates that they may approach the bottom of the mountain. We don't know who blows the horn. Some have suggested that it's the wind whistling, but specifically it says ram's horn, so this is not wind whistling through the mountains. This is actually from a ram's horn. Perhaps it is God who has supernaturally produced the sound. Perhaps Moses has someone else blow it. No one is told who is blowing it, but we are told no one may approach the mountain until it is blown, and if they do, they are to be killed, not even touched to be killed, but killed at a distance with arrow or stone, so that no one has to touch the defiled person who went on God's holy mountain. The prohibition is so severe it's actually repeated twice. Moses is to tell the people to stay away from the mountain. And then once Moses ascends the mountain and enters the cloud, he's actually told to go back down and warn the people again, which leads Moses to protest, as if to say, I just got up here and now I have to go back down again? To which God says, yes, it's that serious. God is that holy. No one may approach God. Exodus 19 even mentions priests that may not approach. Priests who haven't been identified at this point in the book of Exodus, meaning that this mention of priests is either those who would become priests or perhaps hinting at the idea that there are some already in that role before God limited the role to the line of Aaron and the clan of Levites. But the point is the same. Even these proto-priests cannot approach God's holy mountain because God is an awesome God. God is a consuming fire. He cannot be approached. God is holy and awesome and terrifying. He cannot be approached at all. Following God's demonstration of awe and splendor and glory on Mount Sinai, God makes it very clear that Moses is the only one who's able to go up on the mountain and meet with God. This certainly elevates Moses in the eyes of the people. But before Moses goes up on the mountain, Exodus chapters 19 through 23 tell of the formation of a covenant between God and Israel, which we will examine in greater detail in our third lecture. But what is important for us in this lecture is that God agrees to be Israel's God. Or perhaps more accurately, Israel agrees to be God's people. Since God has been Israel's God since the time of Abraham, it's just that Israel needs to figure out they're God's people, which they do, agreeing to be God's people and agreeing to obey God's commandments because of what God has already done for them, delivering them from Egypt. Once the covenant has been made in Exodus 19 through 23, Exodus chapter 24 follows in a way that really answers the dilemma of Exodus 19. Who may ascend the hill of the Lord? Who can go up on Mount Sinai? Well, no one except Moses, God's chosen mediator. But in Exodus chapter 24, the elders of Israel prepare to do what no one else could do. They prepare to ascend the mountain. One has to wonder, theoretically, what was going through the mind of the elders in Exodus chapter 24 as they prepared to climb the mountain of God. Because in Exodus 19, when God came down on the mountain, he said, "Stay away, kill anyone who comes near." There was preparation made for God's appearance. Israel had to be holy, but even holy, they could not approach the mountain of God. They weren't that holy. Now in Exodus chapter 24, God says, "Come near." Not all the people, but the elders come near with Moses. And again, be holy. And again, other preparations are made. The people must be sprinkled in blood. Sacrifices are made by the young men. Again, perhaps the situation as it existed before the institution of the priesthood involved young men. We don't know who these young men are any more than we know who the priests are in Exodus 19, but they do offer the sacrifices here in Exodus chapter 24. Not the blood of sin offerings. There is no guilt offering here, but these are still burnt offerings. There's still blood. This is the blood of the covenant, said Moses, the blood that seals the covenant made in chapters 19 through 23 of the book of Exodus. Just as Jesus speaks of his own blood sealing the covenant of grace, as he refers to his own blood as the blood of the covenant in the Lord's Supper. The people, though, are not offering sin offerings, and yet they must still be covered in blood in order to approach God. The elders must be covered in blood to approach God, to show that they're forgiven, but also to show that the sealing of the covenant has been accomplished. They have been sealed in blood. The covenant that has been established has been sealed in blood between God and Israel. So the people are sprinkled. And not just sprinkled, that sounds too neat and proper. The word that Victor Hamilton uses is dashed. I even like splashed or sprayed. The word sprinkled in Hebrew is intended to emphasize the droplets, that the blood was dispersed, sprayed out on the people. Those in the front of the crowd, probably especially the 74 elders who ascend the mountain of the Lord, were likely covered in blood. But it's that blood that allows them to approach God and not be consumed. God, we are told in Exodus 24, does not lay his hand on them, but allows them to eat in his presence, to enjoy a fellowship offering, a peace offering of sorts, to confirm the covenant. Having made the covenant, they can now enter his presence, eat in his presence. This really foreshadows all that is to come in the tabernacle and Israel's ceremonies in chapters 25 through 40 of Exodus and the book of Leviticus. And all of it starts right here in chapter 24. Actually, to say that Exodus 24 is where it all begins is not entirely correct. Exodus 24 is where we might say the tabernacle begins, as Mount Sinai takes on itself the identity of the tabernacle of God, temporarily, as God tabernacles or dwells with his people. But really, Mount Sinai summarizes much that comes before in the Old Testament concerning the presence of God in holy places. really making most evident all that has been subtly hinted at in the previous chapters and stories in the Pentateuch. Again, the most obvious summarized data point in Exodus chapter 24 concerns the presence of God. Mount Sinai is where Israel's elders temporarily have access to the presence of God. They see God in Exodus chapter 24 as they eat in his presence. At least they see his feet seated on the broad expanse, the broad pavement of heaven, as it were. Again, keeping in mind that God does not permanently live on Mount Sinai, but with his people and in heaven. And yet here on Mount Sinai in Exodus 24, Israel's elders encounter both. They encounter an access point, an axis point of the glory of heaven in their midst here on the mountain. A summary of all the previous axis points, A-X-I-S, points between heaven and earth that have existed in the Garden of Eden, in Bethel, where Jacob met God, and every time a patriarch built an altar, even as Moses himself built altars at the beginning of Exodus 24. There were no permanent altars, as one scholar has pointed out. The patriarchs built a new altar every time they believed themselves to be in the presence of God. There were no permanent worship places, because they understood that God moved. God was not tied to a single location the way a geographic God of the ancient Near East would have been. Abraham on Mount Moriah prepares to offer Isaac, and when he does not, he offers offerings on the altar, the ram that is caught in the bushes. And yet Abraham understood that God was not only on Mount Moriah. Noah built an altar upon exiting the ark. They all believed that heaven and earth were temporarily intersecting in some way. The elders see the same thing here, an idea that will be encapsulated into the tabernacle, that in the tabernacle earth and heaven collide. For now, Mount Sinai is, for a few chapters, the tabernacle. And then the tabernacle itself will become the tabernacle, where earth and heaven collide, until finally in 1 Kings under Solomon, the temple becomes the axis point. The function of Mount Sinai is really to take all the previous appearances of God, the cloud, the pillar of fire, Jacob's ladder, all of those, and say, those are done. Now it's in one place, and one place alone, the mountain of God, soon to take the form of a transportable mountain in the tabernacle, the tent. But all of those places now are found in just one place. There is just one place to meet God, which means that the tabernacle is now more than simply a tent of meeting, although that term is still used. But now the tent of meeting proper, the tabernacle, will be the only access point to access God. We also see Israel's cosmology revealed in the three levels of Mount Sinai. Again, a summary of Israel's cosmology that began in the Garden of Eden. Eden itself was a temple, and the garden was like the Holy of Holies, an idea that's really visible in the construction of Solomon's temple, but even in the construction of the tabernacle with the various artistry that is displayed. But even here on Mount Sinai, there's a reflection of a temple and a Holy of Holies. The people of Israel can only come to the base of the mountain. The elders can come into the middle of the mountain. They eat in the presence of God, but Moses ascends the mountain to its summit. Just as the people will enter the temple courts, but no further, the priests will enter the holy place and eat in the presence of God, eating the bread from the table of showbread that is in the tabernacle. And the high priest will enter into the very holy of holies. The high priest, who at this point is still Moses, he enters into that most holy place, and then only once a year, as we find out in Leviticus 16. Everything outside of the Sinai region is the world. Just as all that is outside the tabernacle courts is the world, the rest, to which Israel had a responsibility, but it's still outside the courts. And yet, most importantly in Exodus chapter 24, some have come near. Others have to stay away, but some come. An idea communicated by the tabernacle construction again and again. Some can come near, some nearer than others. Some have to stay farther away. An idea, again, that is summarized and emphasized here in Exodus chapter 24, summarizing Israel's theology and understanding of holy places that form the background to the tabernacle. An access point, an axis point, a point of approach, but also communicating that some people cannot approach, that they must stay away. Israel's priests, Israel's high priests can approach, not just anybody, only certain individuals, which we'll look at in just a moment. Now that Exodus chapter 19 and Exodus chapter 24 have established the theological framework for the tabernacle and how Israel viewed the tabernacle, and now that Exodus chapter 20 through Exodus chapter 23 have established the early covenant between God and Israel, the covenant foundation for the tabernacle, we're ready to proceed to the actual tabernacle. Exodus chapter 25 through Exodus chapter 40 relate the construction of the tabernacle, although we could really subdivide these chapters into chapter 25 through chapter 31 that deal with the instruction of how to build the tabernacle. And we're told specifically in chapter 31 that there are two individuals, Aholiab and Bezalel, that have been tasked with the construction of the tabernacle to implement the instructions that have been given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. God says that he has anointed, by his Spirit, anointed these two men, Aholiab and Bezalel, in order to construct the tabernacle. Remember that in the Old Testament there are 5 groups of people that receive the power of the Holy Spirit: prophets, priests, kings, warriors, and artists. This is in part because Israel understood God creating the world by his Spirit of wisdom, and so they understood that those who create, as God created, those who are creative, like artists, also have the power of the Spirit of God, the Spirit of wisdom, the Holy Spirit, to be able to create. And so we see God empowering and anointing these two particular individuals to do what needs to be done for the building of the tabernacle. This is also important because the tabernacle is very carefully regulated. It is very important then that in Exodus chapter 35 through Exodus chapter 40, we see Aholiab and Bezalel specifically putting all the instructions that they have received into practice. They're not being spontaneous in their being anointed with the Holy Spirit. They are anointed by the Holy Spirit to do what they have been instructed to do. The blueprint that has been given to them by God concerning the tabernacle, its furniture, the priestly garments, it is supposed to be followed by them to the T, to the very letter of the instructions. It's not just a series of guidelines, it is a very specific blueprint. And this is because of the theology that we've already seen in Exodus chapter 24, where the tabernacle is reflective of Mount Sinai, but really the experience of the elders and Moses on Mount Sinai showed us that these places on earth where God meets with his people are supposed to be a reflection of God's heavenly throne room. The sapphire pavement, that blue pavement that God's feet are seen seated upon in Exodus chapter 24, is supposed to remind everyone of heaven, as though they're looking into heaven, looking up to the top of the mountain, but not seeing God seated on the mountain or standing on the mountain, but really looking even above the mountain, looking into the very throne room of God, which will be the Holy of Holies. So the tabernacle needs to be specific because it is reflective of a very specific blueprint, something that exists in that spiritual plane, that spiritual reality. The writer of Hebrews emphasizes this, that Moses was to make according to what had been revealed on the mountain. He was supposed to make the tabernacle because it reflected heaven. It reflected God's throne room. The Holy of Holies was where God dwelt. And even the cherubim on the curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place was supposed to be a reminder of that reality, that God dwelt in heaven, but heaven had come to earth in this access point, where on earth the high priest could enter into the most holy place, but really enter into God's presence, into that heavenly throne room. Even as the writer of Hebrews tells us that Christ entered not into the tabernacle made by human hands, but into the tabernacle, the temple in glory, entering into the very holy of holies, to lay his own blood upon the altar of God. This is why the instruction and the construction of the tabernacle is so important. And so in Exodus chapter 35 through Exodus chapter 40, Aholiab and Bezalel do exactly what they have been commanded to do. Not spontaneous, not with any adaptation, doing exactly what they are told to do. It's also interesting that the first section of instruction ends in Exodus chapter 31 with a discussion on Sabbath. Exodus chapter 35, which begins the section on construction, begins with Sabbath. And so we have these bookends on the middle chapters surrounded by Sabbath, Because again, going all the way back to creation, this is the goal of the tabernacle, Sabbath, for God to dwell with his people, to rest with his people, to be in the presence of his people, and for his people to rest with them. Sabbath was the goal of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and it is the goal of the tabernacle and the temple. Unfortunately, in the middle, we have chapters 32 through 34 that tell us of the golden calf incident, which we'll look at in a little bit of detail in just a moment. But the important part about those middle chapters is that they're really dealing still with the theology of the tabernacle, because the question that Israel is asking is, where is Moses, where is God? And the tabernacle answers that question. God is in our midst. God is right here. And so the tabernacle is really supplying what it is that Israel was longing for in its golden calves, doing so without any image of God, but doing it through a tent of meeting, where the cloud of God's glory would descend upon the tabernacle, and Israel would see that's where God is. Exodus chapter 25 tells us that the construction of the tabernacle is being built with goods plundered from Egypt, because Moses asks for offerings from the people of Israel, but they're slaves. They don't have anything to offer except that they have plundered the Egyptians. They have lots of gold. They even have mirrors, which mirrors were considered very important in the ancient Near East. Not sure how those were used in the tabernacle, but even mirrors are donated. All of these offerings come from what was plundered from the Egyptians. The gold, the silver, the bronze of the nations has built this tabernacle. The silks, the yarns, the threads, all of it came from the Egyptians. And Israel now gives it willingly to God for the construction of his tent of meeting here in the midst of Israel. Israel now will know God is with us, because they'll be able to see the cloud hovering over the tabernacle and be told and know God is with us. God, the God who is in heaven, can now be accessed here on earth in this access point, here in this tabernacle where earth and heaven meet. We've already mentioned that the contributions for the tabernacle actually came from the Egyptians. However, it's important to realize how much material we are talking about here. Sarna claims that the erection of the tabernacle would have required about 1 ton of gold, over 3 tons of silver, and about 2.5 tons of bronze. The ark, together with its solid cold cover, would have estimated to have weighed at least 5 tons. Sarna is actually quoting from Albert Schild from the Jewish Press from 1977. And he goes on to say that if there were really plants of acacia wood that were used as planks in the various parts of the temple court, and not just frames, then each of the 48 sections would have weighed at least half a ton each. This, of course, raises questions, as Schild and Sarna both point out, of the issue of their own height having been out of proportion with the amount of load that they needed to bear on such a skinny base. However, that's probably why they were all hooked together, in part to keep them all from falling over. But again, it tells us just how much material was needed in order to build the tabernacle. This is the contributions that have been plundered from Egypt. Not just a little plundering, but a lot of plundering. We go on throughout chapters 25 through chapter 31 to lay out the actual furniture that goes in the tabernacle, as well as the tabernacle courts themselves and the tabernacle proper. We need to keep in mind that some of the vocabulary here is a little confusing. For instance, we have these frames. Sometimes it's translated as planks. We're not really exactly sure what this is, but it's some sort of wooden structure that the fabric is going to go over in order to create both the tabernacle and the tabernacle courts. We also have the Ark of the Covenant that is created, most likely to be a footstool for God. Footstools in the ancient Near East were where elements of the covenant were kept, copies of the covenant were kept, so it's no accident then that a copy of the Ten Commandments ends up in the Ark of the Covenant. This is God's throne, although he's really enthroned above the cherubim, so that it's as though his feet were sitting on the mercy seat. So it's kind of a combination of a seat, a throne, a footstool. It is more or less the throne of God, the one who is enthroned above the cherubim, on the cherubim, riding on the cherubim. All of these poetic descriptions of God portrayed there in the Ark of the Covenant. We also have the table of bread, 12 loaves of bread that are representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Again, this is somewhat of a precursor, as it were, to the Lord's Supper, as the priests would go in and eat in the presence of God, eat the bread of the covenant there in the holy place. And the lamp was supposed to shine on the bread. Well, we find this out more in the book of Numbers, but we see this even here in Exodus as the lamp is trimmed and set up and is constantly burning. It is there to cast light onto the bread so that Israel lives symbolically in the presence of God. The tabernacle itself is set up in chapter 26 of Exodus, and then we return again to more furniture. The altar of sacrifices that's out in the tabernacle courts, and then we return to the court of the tabernacle, and then we come back inside and talk about the oil for the lamp, the priests, their garments in chapters 28 and 29, along with their ordination, and then the altar of incense, the basin. We're also told about the census that is taken, the temple tax as it became known as, the tabernacle tax, that half shekel tax that's supposed to be collected whenever there is a census of the people, but it's a way to provide for the upkeep of the tabernacle. This blood of the atonement, as it's often referred to, this covering. There's an irony then at the end of 2 Samuel as David is trying to number the people but doesn't collect the tax and then ends up starting a plague so that he ends up having to offer a sacrifice on the location of Araunah the Jebusite, his threshing floor, which will become the site of the temple, which again is for atonement. So David, who has skipped the atonement tax, eventually provides for the place of atonement. We also have the bronze basin, the washing place where the priests would wash their hands, their feet before entering into the holy place. And then we finish with a discussion of the anointing oil and the incense. In the construction phase, we have a slightly different order of the various pieces of furniture, but still pretty similar. We have the tabernacle proper being set up first, and then ark, table, lampstand, just as we saw before in chapter 25. Instead of the altar of burnt offering, we have the altar of incense, then the altar of burnt offering, then the basin, then the court, and no discussion about the mixing of incense or the oil for the lamp. That was just simply part of the instruction phase. So we have instruction, construction, both of the tabernacle and of the actual furniture. One last comment on the actual construction has to do with the element of the cubit. The cubit could range anywhere from about 17 inches to about 22.5 inches, depending on whose arm you were using. It was supposed to be from the tip of the middle finger to the elbow. We typically say it's about 18 inches, but that's ballpark. And so it's difficult to know the exact amount of length that is being described here. It's probably ballpark again, 18 inches, so we can kind of measure off roughly how long this was, but a lot of it depended on whose arm you were using for the measurement. Not exactly an exact measurement, at least at this time in Israel's history. Perhaps later on it became more codified in terms of what a standard cubit was. But we do see this description amount, so we at least have proportions of what the tabernacle construction would have involved. Again, the tabernacle being God's place where he dwells with his people in the most holy place. So the closer you get to the most holy place, the more precious the metals, gold. And then as you come out, silver with various bases being of silver around the tabernacle. And then coming out into the courts where everything is of bronze, the more distance you get. The tabernacle itself would have been set up to face from east to west with the door pointing east, pointing out east away from the Holy of Holies, just as east was away from Eden, that Holy of Holies, which will become very important as we look at the Day of Atonement. I mentioned that Exodus chapter 25 through 31 build towards the mention of Sabbath at the end of chapter 31, which is then emphasized again at the beginning of chapter 35, this idea of Sabbath. And really, the emphasis is even more strong than that, Because in the instruction section, in chapters 25 through chapter 31, 6 times it is said, and God spoke to Moses. The Lord spoke to Moses. And the 7th time that God says, the Lord spoke to Moses, it's in this discussion at the end of chapter 35 related to the Sabbath on the 7th day, the 7th time. Certainly not coincidence. The structure continues to emphasize Sabbath, because Sabbath really is the very foundation, the very theological idea of the tabernacle, God dwelling with his people. That was the goal back in Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2. That was God's goal, was to dwell with his people. Even as we see in the Gudea cylinder that we have of an ancient king, Gudea building a temple in 7 years, God takes 7 days. God is building a temple in Genesis 1 and 2, a temple for him to inhabit. And just as Gudea receives his instructions directly from a God as to how to build his temple, so God has revealed to Moses how to build God's tabernacle, because the tabernacle is reflective of creation. It's reflective of the mountain, those different levels. The Holy of Holies, which is the top of the mountain, which is the very throne room of God. The holy place, which is the middle of the mountain, which is the place where, to a large degree, along with the courts, is where Israel dwells in the presence of God. But then everything outside the tabernacle, everything outside the mountain, at the bottom of the mountain, going out into the fields around the mountain, is the rest of the world. And Israel understood that God was coming to dwell in the midst of the world on his mountain, but now is coming to dwell in the midst of the world in the tabernacle. This is the one access point, the one axis point where God is going to dwell with his people, where he is going to take up residence. And so it is no accident that on this discussion of the Sabbath at the end of Exodus chapter 31, that there's an emphasis on in 6 days God created the world, and on the 7th day he rested, because that's what takes place in the tabernacle. God is going to rest. God is going to take up residence finally with his people, which is why there is so much emphasis upon it in the tabernacle, because this needs to be drilled into Israel's head. Because with the golden calf, that's really what they're asking. Is God present with us? They want a sign. They want a symbol. They see the cloud way up on the mountain, and they wonder, is Moses ever coming back? They wonder if God is really with them. Is that really God on the mountain? And so they have the golden calves constructed so that they're able to say to the golden calf, this is our God, as Aaron says. They're able to look at it and say, this is our God who led us out of Egypt. We know he's with us. We sense his presence. He's right here. But that's what the tabernacle does. The tabernacle answers that question as well. God is right here. In fact, not only that, we have in Exodus chapter 34, we have Moses meeting with God, both seeing his presence, as Moses says, show me your presence, show me you're with us. Don't send us up from here unless you're going to go with us, that reconfirmation of the covenant promises of God. But Moses seeing the presence of God in all of his glory, reminding us that all of that glory is now going to fill the tabernacle in Exodus chapter 40. And we see the shining face of Moses, again, the reminder of the glory of God, that that's what Moses has beheld, that's what Moses has met with, and now that is what will be in the tabernacle, which is really setting the stage then for us to ask the question, well, how do we approach? How do we approach that presence, that glory that is in the tabernacle? Because as the book of Exodus ends in Exodus chapter 40, we notice that Moses is not in the tabernacle. He's not allowed to enter. He actually has to leave because of the cloud of God's glory. But before we saw him interacting with the cloud of God's glory. The face of his face glowed. So why is it now that he cannot participate and be in the tent of meeting when God's glory is in there? Why now can he not meet with God face to face? Which really sets up for us then the importance of Leviticus, because it answers that question. How can we approach the glory of God? How can we enter into the tabernacle and behold God's glory the way that Moses did in Exodus chapter 34? That is the genius of Leviticus, but also the genius of the end of Exodus, really raising this question for us. Sabbath rest, God is in our presence, but how do we enter his presence? There are 2 other sections of chapters that need to be dealt with before we move on to section 2 of this lecture, and that deals with Leviticus chapter 24 and Numbers chapter 1 through 9. Leviticus chapter 24 has to do with the lamp and the table of showbread, or the table of presence, Since the emphasis in Leviticus is on priestly duties, this is a reminder of what it is that the priest is supposed to do to the lampstand and the bread, since there is some ongoing preparation that takes place here. The incense altar has incense placed upon it whenever someone is in the holy place to shield them from the presence of Almighty God. Especially on the Day of Atonement, incense is placed upon that altar. But the lamp has to be constantly tended so that it is always lit, and the table has to have the bread continually changed, and the bread is supposed to be eaten by the priests. And so there is some emphasis there within Leviticus chapter 24 of what the priest is supposed to do to these two particular pieces of furniture. In Numbers chapters 1 through 9, we see another discussion of the Levites, or the priestly clan, and the tabernacle. Especially in chapter 9, we see again a discussion of the lamp and the table, with the lamp specifically being said to shine upon the 12 loaves of bread, again reminding us that Israel is supposed to live in the presence of Almighty God. The lamp representing the lamp of God, the light of God, the light of the world, and the table representing Israel. Again, we see some analogy between the table and the Lord's Supper, but there is really that emphasis on the 12 tribes dwelling in the light of God's glory. Chapter 2 of Numbers 1 through 9 not only give us a census of Israel and a sense of where Israel lived, but remind us that the tabernacle is at the center. The presence of God is in the center of Israel, and the Levites form a protective barrier around it. That way, the glory of God is divided from the uncleanness potentially of Israel, the Levites being that barrier, as it were. The transportation by the various clans of the Levites of the instruments and the various pieces of furniture of the tabernacle are described in Numbers chapter 4, reminding us that only the Kohathites could carry the furniture. The other two clans of Levi deal with the tabernacle proper and the other odds and ends that need to be addressed. It is the sons of Aaron who are the ones that go in and cover the pieces of furniture, but it's the Kohathites who will eventually carry them. Numbers chapter 7 seems like a very odd passage because it just repeats over and over and over again, but this reminds us that the tabernacle is universally accessible to all of Israel. Anybody, any tribe in Israel can come to the tabernacle and worship. There are no tribes that are left out. Again, it seems like a very odd emphasis, or at least an odd way to go about the emphasis. But the emphasis here is upon the fact that all of the tribes of Israel, all 12 of them, can come and worship God in his presence. God is present not just in one tribe. God is present in the midst of all of Israel. All can come and experience that Sabbath rest at the tabernacle, basking in his presence. Having discussed the tabernacle, we are now ready to examine the ceremonies that took place within Israel's worship. And really, there are two types of ceremonies highlighted for us in the books of Leviticus and Numbers, and hinted at in the book of Exodus. In Leviticus, we find the sacrificial system outlined for us in great detail, including the types of sacrifices, the participants, who is it that participated in the actual sacrifice and who benefited from it and received portions of the sacrifices, as well as the theology of the sacrifices. What do the particular sacrifices point us to in the new covenant? We also have a second type of ceremony, and that is the celebration or the feasts that took place within Israel's calendar. And there are various types and various reasons why each of these festivals are celebrated. And so we will need to examine where on the calendar they are celebrated, why they are celebrated, what was the purpose for them within Israel's worship, and what is the theology behind those particular sacrifices. What do they point us to in the new covenant? How are we supposed to understand them, and what are we supposed to do with them? Are we supposed to be celebrating them still? These are questions that will be answered for us largely in the book of Leviticus and Numbers, as those are the two books where we will find the various festivals of Israel's calendar outlined for us. So let's go ahead and begin with Leviticus chapter 1 and look at the sacrificial system. Before we can look at the book of Leviticus, we need to look at a problem in Exodus chapter 40, and that is that the cloud of God's glory has filled the tabernacle, coming off of Mount Sinai, taking up temporary residence in this transportable tabernacle, this transportable mountain of God that will transport the glory of God to Mount Zion, except that we're told that as the cloud of God's glory enters the tabernacle, Moses cannot enter. which is quite odd. Moses has been into the cloud of God's glory multiple times. Moses, the man who speaks face to face with God. Moses, the one who interacts with God at the top of Mount Sinai. Why can Moses not enter the tabernacle? This really sets up the question, who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may enter the tabernacle? Who may approach God's glory? The dilemma that shows up at the end of Exodus chapter 40 really sets the stage for the book of Leviticus, explaining to the readers and to Israel that the way that Israel approaches God is through the sacrificial system. No longer, now that the tabernacle has been constructed, no longer will Moses and anyone else for that matter be able to approach God's glory simply whenever they decide to. Instead, there are rules and regulations now for entering into the presence of God. Now there are rules and regulations as to who may enter the tabernacle and how. This really sets the stage for the book of Leviticus, and if we miss Exodus chapter 40, then we miss the significance of Leviticus, especially as Leviticus begins with God speaking from the tabernacle to Moses outside the tabernacle, in essence saying, "This is how you approach me." The details of the sacrificial system are found in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. Many of the sacrifices here are listed twice, and that is because chapters 1 through 6 explain the actual details of the sacrifice, but the second half of chapter 6 through chapter 7 give the administrative details to the priests of how they are exactly supposed to offer the sacrifice, especially what is supposed to be done with the leftovers. Chapters 1 through 6 are more from the general perspective of Israel. Chapters 6b through chapter 7 are from the perspective of the priest. In chapters 1 through 3 of Leviticus, we have 3 types of sacrifice listed, and they are all connected in the fact that they are all considered to be a pleasing aroma to the Lord. We have the burnt offering, which is burnt up completely, unless the offering happens to be birds, in which case the crop and the guts of the bird are actually tossed in the ashes to the east of the altar. If it's from the herd, so a bull or a ram, if it's from the flock, whether a sheep, it needs to be a male. The birds are not specified in terms of gender, only if it's from the herd or the flock. In these cases, it is all consumed, and the entire offering is considered a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The second type of offering listed is the grain offering, and this too is considered a pleasing aroma to the Lord, although only a portion of the grain offering is actually sacrificed. What is important with the grain offering is that it needs to include salt, it needs to be anointed with oil and frankincense, and there needs to be no leaven whatsoever. In the Old Testament, leaven represents sin. Apostle Paul picks up on this in the New Testament, talks about leaven, as does the writer of Hebrews, getting rid of the leaven. This could be made into flour or cakes or first fruits, but in any case, they're all considered grain offerings, and they are burnt, and that burnt portion is considered a pleasing aroma, with what was left over given to the priest. The final type of offering that is a pleasing aroma is the peace offering. It too could be from the herd or the flock, or could be a goat. It was male or female, it didn't matter. In this type of offering, only the fat and the kidneys were burnt. The rest was eaten by the priest and the worshiper. The worshiper had 2 days to eat the leftovers from the peace offering. In summary, we are told at the end of chapter 3 that you are not supposed to eat blood. Blood is supposed to be poured out, and you're not supposed to eat fat. Fat is the portion of the Lord. If you have smelled fat burning, fat actually smells pretty good. But it's not supposed to be just that fat smells good, it's the memorial portion of the Lord's that is burnt. Whether it smells good or not to us as human beings, like fat does on a grill, it is considered all a pleasing aroma. Even if it's burning grain, which doesn't have the greatest of smells, it's considered a pleasing aroma to the Lord. In Leviticus chapter 4, the focus changes, no longer dealing with those offerings that are a pleasing aroma to the Lord, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering. Now instead we have a focus on the sin and the guilt offerings, sometimes what are called expiatory offerings or expiation offerings, those offerings that deal with the removal of sin, or propitiatory or propitiation offerings, those that satisfy the wrath of a god. The sin offering is mentioned in chapter 4 through chapter 5, specifically for unintentional sin. There really is no offering in the Old Testament for intentional sin, sins of the high hand, as Numbers calls them. Those sins usually are met with the death penalty. Although chapter 5 does hint at the fact that there are some types of intentional sins, such as wrath oath or not testifying when called to or touching an unclean body, that are covered by sin offerings and are perhaps less unintentional than fully unintentional. The type of offering required an examination of who did the sin. For instance, if it was a priest, then the offering was a bull, and the blood was actually taken into the tabernacle, sprinkled 7 times within the holy place, and the horns of the altar of incense specifically were touched and anointed. The fat and the kidneys were burnt, and the rest was taken out of camp. If the whole congregation sinned, the actions were exactly the same as the offerings of a priest. The bull was killed, the blood was taken in the tabernacle, sprinkled 7 times, the horns of the altar of incense were sprinkled, and the fat and the kidneys were burnt, and the rest was taken out of camp. There were no leftovers when there was a sin offering made for a priest or the whole congregation. If a leader, however, made the sin and needed to offer a sin offering, not a priest, not the whole congregation, but a leader, perhaps a chief of a particular tribe or a chieftain, the male goat would be offered rather than a bull. The blood would not be taken into the tabernacle, and instead of anointing the horns of the altar of incense, it was the horns of the main altar that were anointed. The fat and the kidneys were burnt, and even though there is no mention of the rest of the sacrifice, we find out later that in instances where the sin offering is not carried into the tabernacle, which would cover the sin offering of leaders and commoners, the actual sacrifice leftovers can be eaten by the priest. A commoner, like a leader, has a sacrifice made, although this time it's not a male goat, it's a female goat, or perhaps a lamb, or perhaps 2 turtle doves. Again, the blood is not taken into the tabernacle. The blood is put on the horns of the main altar. The fat and the kidneys are burnt, as always, and in this case, again, it is the priest that could have the leftovers, as we'll find out in chapters 6 and 7. In chapters 5 and 6, we have a discussion of the guilt offering. This again is for unintentional sin and seems to be required more for making restitution, for touching holy things or doing holy things, perhaps not doing what was appropriate in terms of sacrifices, perhaps not dedicating those things that needed to be dedicated, perhaps touching things that weren't supposed to be touched, that were considered holy, perhaps those things belonging to the priest. Restitution had to be made, adding a 5th for the restitution. Restitution also had to be made for theft or deception. So it seems as though the guilt offering, while unintentional, is actually taking something from someone. And in this case, a ram was supposed to be offered, although uniquely to the guilt offering in chapters 5 and 6, the ram could also have offered the equivalent, or literally, in your estimation, perhaps the estimation of the priest, who estimated and said that the offering that was being offered was the equivalent of a ram. The ram is unique here in that a ram is not offered at any other point in the sacrificial system other than this guilt offering made for restitution. In Leviticus chapter 6, beginning in verse 8, all the way through chapter 7, we start all over and go through all the sacrifices again. Only this time it's in a slightly different order, not by much, but this time the emphasis is not so much upon the aroma that is pleasing to the Lord, but instead upon what is eaten, what is not eaten, what the priest gets to do with the actual leftovers. We're told that the burnt offering is to be completely consumed, which we knew, and the ashes are to be carried out of camp. The fire is supposed to never go out on the altar, unless, of course, I suppose it's being moved, but perhaps even then they carried it while it was burning. The grain offering, we're told, can be eaten by any male of the priestly family, although it needs to be eaten in a holy place, such as in the temple courts or tabernacle courts or within the tabernacle itself. From the grain offering, the priest is actually supposed to offer a tithe, a tenth of an ephah. He's supposed to offer half of that tenth, so a 20th in the morning, and then another 20th in the evening. And because it is his portion that is being offering from the grain that has already been apportioned to him, it is supposed to be completely burned on the altar. The sin offering, we're told, that the male priest may eat it also in a holy place, although only if the blood is not taken into the tabernacle, which would be the case if the offering was for a worshiper or for a leader of Israel. The same with the guilt offering. All the male priests may eat it in a holy place. Typically, for both the guilt offering and the sin offering, it was the actual priest doing the offering who would receive that particular portion and would eat it. The grain offering, if it's uncooked, would also be for the priest that's offering it. But if it's not cooked, then all of the priests could share it. All of the males in the line of Aaron could share it. If it's a peace offering, it's not only eaten by the priest, but it's also eaten by the worshiper, although he has only 2 days to eat it. If there are leftovers on the third day, then it was supposed to be completely consumed by fire. End of chapter 7 ends with some last-minute administrative details, a reminder that you have to be clean in order to eat of these sacrifices and participate in these sacrifices, which sets us up then for the chapters following chapter 11 through chapter 15 that will deal with various issues of cleanness. Again, there's the reminder not to eat fat. There's a reminder not to eat blood. And there's a reminder that especially of the sin offering, it is the right breast and the thigh that belong to the priests, getting very specific as to what portion belonged to the priests, simply so Israel knows that they are eating the right breast and the thigh as priests, and the rest can be eaten, at least in a peace offering, eaten by the people. But even in a sin offering, it is the right breast and the thigh that are eaten by the priests. God being very careful to specify exactly which part of the leftovers are his. Leviticus chapter 22 tells us some of the guidelines for the various sacrifices, specifying what exactly it means that an animal is without blemish and must be perfect. This means that a limb cannot be longer than another. There can't be a cut or a crush or a disease, nothing sick. The animal must be perfect. If the only problem with the animal is that one limb is potentially longer than another, it can be used as a free will offering. Some blemish, including the longer limbs, are allowed there, but in all other types of offerings, the offering must be perfect. It also must be at least 8 days old. Any offering that is less than 8 days old may not be offered and will not be accepted. Additionally, a mother and the offspring are not to be killed on the same day. This is very similar to the regulation that a mother is not to be have her milk used to boil the kid. The mother and the offspring are not supposed to be tied that closely. It's just cruel. Even God's care for the animals is seen here. We also have a reference at the end of Leviticus chapter 22 to the sacrifice of thanksgiving. This is the only place that this type of sacrifice is mentioned, and it is probably a type of peace offering. Although the peace offerings are traditionally free will offerings and offerings for vows, they are to be eaten on the day of the sacrifice and the next day. But this sacrifice of thanksgiving must be eaten on the same day that it is offered. It may not be left to the next day, like the other types of peace offerings. We don't really have any comment in the text as to why this is the only place that this type of sacrifice is mentioned. It's mentioned many times in the Psalms, but this is the only place that thanksgiving is mentioned. Perhaps this suggests that these categories of sacrifices are broad categories, and at least with peace offerings, that there are typical subsets of these. Although this is the only one that seems to occur out of nowhere, this is the only one that suddenly pops up and we're left wondering what type of sacrifice it is. So perhaps this is an exhaustive list, but this does raise questions as to whether or not that's actually the case. Perhaps the most important question as we look at these sacrifices is, what is the new covenant application? The application of the sin and the guilt is obvious. This points us ahead to Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, reminding us that in Christ all of our sin is forgiven, it has been removed, it has been expunged, our guilt is gone, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We are reminded that Christ is our propitiation. The wrath of God has been satisfied for all time. So obviously, as we consider the sin offering, the guilt offering, as we consider the Day of Atonement, which we'll talk about in just a second, Leviticus chapter 16, we know that Christ himself, the great high priest, carries his own blood into the most holy place in glory and has offered his sacrifice once for all. But what about the other offerings? What about the fellowship offerings? What about peace offerings? What about burnt offerings? What about grain offerings? There's a number of different ways that these will apply, and I'll only mention a couple because we'll discuss this a little bit more in our class discussion. But some of these offerings remind us of the fellowship that we have with God through prayer, the fellowship that we have with God through the Lord's Supper, especially as we understand the fellowship that the priests had with God by eating the bread that was on the table in the most holy place, in the tabernacle. We realize that we have fellowship with God, and we no longer need to sacrifice animals because the blood of Christ covers us so much, covers our sin and our guilt, that now we have fellowship with God at any point. But it does remind us of the need to continue to offer our offerings to God, to continue to offer up our prayers and our praises, the sacrifice of praise, as the psalmist says, reminding us that we do have peace with God. We eat with God in the Lord's Supper, in communion. We fellowship with Him. We need to be very thankful for what we have and take advantage of that, even as we consider what these Old Testament sacrifices point us to, and really the greatness of the new covenant, that we can enter into the most holy place of God at any moment in prayer, fellowshipping with Him, without having to offer sacrifices, without having to turn everything into smoke so that it would mingle with the cloud of His presence. Instead, by the power of the Holy Spirit, we fellowship with Him at any given moment. What a privilege is ours in Christ. Leviticus chapter 8 and 9 talk about the ordination of Aaron and his 4 sons as priests, which we'll get to in just a few moments. They are the ones who are going to do all the sacrifices that we talk about in chapters 1 through 7. But in chapter 10, 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, attempt to offer unauthorized fire, or strange fire. They put fire from the altar in their censers, and they attempt to offer it to God in some way. There's been lots of discussion over what exactly they are doing. What we know is that they are not doing what they were told to do in chapters 1 through 7. They're doing something that's very extracurricular, outside of the normative of what God has prescribed in chapters 1 through 7, which should be a caution for us. 2 of the major perspectives related to the worship of God are the normative principle, we can do anything that God has not forbid, or the regulative principle, we only do what God commands. And you can really see potentially both at work here, because it's possible that they have simply gone outside of what's prescribed in chapters 1 through 7, which is why the fire of God comes out and consumes them. They're not following regulated worship. It's also possible, though, that they attempted to enter into the most holy place. We later read in later chapters that God warns Aaron not to come into the most holy place whenever he wants, but only on the Day of Atonement. And so it's possible that it's not so much that they violated regulative worship, but that they violated an explicit command from God or an explicit principle of going into the most holy place when they weren't supposed to. Again, we don't really know, but that does seem to be likely. Again, that's not to discount regulated worship, because the text certainly sets us up to understand they've been given all these specific instructions in chapters 1 through 7, and even the ordination sacrifices in chapters 8 and 9. Now, as Dr. Dennis McGarry at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School said, now is not the time for spontaneity in worship. God has given specific regulations that are to be followed. However, we do find later regulations that suggest that they may have violated a particular principle, entering into the most holy place. Aaron is told not to mourn, and then Moses gets really upset because the sin offering is offered, and yet Aaron did not follow the regulations. He did not do what was supposed to be done. He didn't take the blood of the sin offering into the tabernacle. Instead, he burned up the entire sin offering, not taking parts of it outside the camp. Aaron's response is very odd. He says to Moses, even if I'd done it right, would God have accepted me? And Moses says, yes, you're right, that's correct. And he approves it. We don't really know why this conversation took place. Perhaps Aaron is saying, if I'd really offered it, I'm contaminated because my sons have done what they were not supposed to do, and I, as the high priest, bear the guilt. And so rather than me making the offering on behalf of others, I've just simply burned the whole thing. That's one possibility. Another possibility is Aaron basically saying to Moses, God's a holy God. Would he have really cared what I did at this point? Again, we don't really know what Aaron is saying, but we do see some of the grace and the mercy demonstrated here that Aaron has violated the regulation. And yet Moses is gracious and understanding for whatever reason, grasped that Aaron was not trying to do this in a devious sort of way, was not trying to violate the commandments of God, but it seems unintentionally violated whatever the regulation was, whatever his motivation may have been. And so Moses has grace and mercy upon him, perhaps suggesting then that Nadab and Abihu at the first part of the chapter did what they did deliberately. Not unintentionally, they may have known exactly what they were doing, and they paid the ultimate sacrifice, being consumed by fire from the tabernacle. Aaron, thankfully, by God's grace, is not consumed and has the understanding and the approval of Moses as God's representative, again, pointing us to the seriousness, the holiness of God, the necessity to worship as he has decreed, and yet also the grace and the mercy of God in the midst of our worship. In Leviticus chapter 11, the focus shifts to clean and unclean. It seems to have very little to do with the sacrificial system, except that Leviticus chapter 7 said that those who are unclean may not participate in the sacrificial system. So chapters 11 through 15 of Leviticus are explaining who exactly is unclean and what to do when they become unclean. In Leviticus chapter 11, the focus is on diet and what makes somebody unclean in terms of what they eat, what animals are clean and unclean. And scholars have suggested many different options for defining why an animal is included in one list or the other. One common suggestion is that those animals associated with death, such as vultures, are unclean because of that death or decaying association. Other scholars have suggested that particular animals carry diseases. Pork is often placed in that category, and so in order to protect the diet health-wise of the Israelites, they were told not to eat particular foods. This has led to the so-called Bible diet that people even today like to try and follow. One other suggestion, which is very convincing in my mind, is that there are simply categories of animals that have a standard, and that if an animal fits the standard, the stereotype of that particular category, then they are clean. So this is a pedagogical purpose of explaining to Israel that there are standards, and that standards of behavior, standards of appearance, standards of identity have to be followed, teaching them that they themselves have a standard that they have to follow. So the stereotype, the standard for land animals is a cow, chews the cud, has 4 legs. If an animal does not fit that, either doesn't chew the cud or doesn't have 4 legs, it can't be eaten. The same with birds. The stereotype bird has feathers and flies. If it doesn't have feathers, if it doesn't fly, it can't be eaten. The same with a fish. A stereotype fish, stereotype seafood, has scales, swims in the sea. If that's not the case, if it doesn't have scales, like a lobster, it cannot be eaten because lobsters don't fit the standard. And so again, this purpose is more to teach Israel the idea that there is a standard even in what they eat. They are to follow standards. Really, it's probably a combination of the three because we can see references to each of these. There are elements of animals that are not allowed because they're associated with death. There are others where it does seem to suggest that there is an arbitrary reason, perhaps related to diet, and then there are those that simply do not fit the category. They don't line up with the standard. All three really teach us clean and unclean, serving a pedagogical purpose, a safety purpose, protecting Israel, but also teaching them about standards. In Leviticus chapter 12, the focus is on uncleanness after childbirth. This obviously only affects females, and tells us how many days they are impure after they have given birth. If they give birth to a male child, they are unclean for 33 days, not allowed to participate in the sacrificial system. If they give birth to a female, it's double, 66 days. And we really have no explanation as to why, although a number of suggestions have been given. Anything connected to the demonic and false religions, perhaps the dislike of females in Israel, although that's a bit extreme. We don't really know why the males have a less of a period of uncleanness. We just know that they do. And we're told that to clean the uncleanness after the time period is up, there's supposed to be an offering of a lamb as a burnt offering and a turtle dove as a sin offering, unless the person is poor, in which case they will offer 2 turtle doves, which is the case of Mary and Joseph after the birth of Jesus. In chapters 13 through 14, we have discussion of leprosy. That's a word that we have used in English, but it's not a very good translation. We just don't really know what this is. The same word is used for an uncleanness in the skin, as is used in the rest of chapter 14 with an uncleanness in houses. Leprosy, obviously, if you're aware of the medical history of that particular disease, most commonly known as Hansen's disease, does not grow in houses. Really, the uncleanness in houses seems to be a type of mold. The emphasis on the word that's translated as leprosy seems to have to do more with flaking. Some people have suggested that it has to do with flaking, and so therefore it's related to snow, it's white, and then that leads to this assumption that it has to do with Hansen's disease, which turns the skin white. And yet it may have to do more with flaking, that this is a flaking type of skin disease, perhaps psoriasis or the like. What's interesting, especially in chapters 13 and 14, is that if a person is completely white, then they're considered clean. It's only if there's some rawness, again, if there's not a completeness, if there's not a wholeness, if there's not, to use the same theory from chapter 11, if there's not a meeting of the standard. This is what people should be like. They need to be all of this and have all of these qualities. And so if you're all of one, perfectly healthy skin, or all of the other, the skin's completely white, then you're allowed to approach God in the sacrificial system. If, on the other hand, though, there is something that is in process, raw skin, or some sort of growth in the skin, or in hair, or in the house that you live in that case, then, you are considered unclean, and you're not allowed to approach, and you're actually, in many cases, asked to go outside the camp, lest you infect somebody else. The process to get rid of the uncleanness in people is quite fascinating. They're sprinkled with blood. They bring in 2 male lambs. One is offered up and one is used as a sin offering. It's almost like the ordination of the priests, which we'll see in Leviticus chapters 8 and 9. They're even anointed with the oil that they bring, because they're supposed to bring a burnt offering, a sin offering, which are the 2 male lambs, but also a grain offering covered in oil. And the leftover oil is placed on their head. The blood is placed on their right earlobe and their right thumb and their right toe, just like the priests. It's almost as though they are being set apart as priests, which is quite fascinating and quite unusual, because this is the only type of disease where we see somebody specifically said to be anointed with oil, much like an ordained office. Not to mention the fact that we're told that it makes atonement for them, a sin offering, atonement. But we're left wondering, well, what sinful thing happened that caused them to have leprosy? And we simply don't know. We're not really told why this is an atonement, and why it's not simply the guilt offering, where they have made themselves unclean. Perhaps this is supposed to reference us back to chapter 5, where there is just a passing comment about someone who may have made themselves unclean. This person perhaps got something contagious, or in some way has not fit the standard of holiness that God requires, in which case atonement is needed, as though they need forgiveness for their particular skin disease. When it's an unclean house, sometimes the house is bulldozed, sometimes the house has just the leprosy removed from the wall, in which case there are 2 birds that are killed. One has the blood sprinkled on the house, the other bird is released, as though it's carrying the disease away with it. The only similar ceremony we have is the Day of Atonement, where it's 2 goats, the goat that's killed and the goat that's released in the wilderness. And so here in these 2 particular instances, with the unclean skin and the unclean house, we have some odd connection with the priestly office, whether with the Day of Atonement, with the 2 released birds and the released goat, or with the unclean skin and them actually being anointed as though they were ordained. Again, with very little comment and very little explanation. It's just simply presented as it is. In chapter 15, we have unclean discharges. This is certainly not a chapter that you want to read when you're eating. Much of this is quite disgusting and medically graphic. And yet what's fascinating again is that we have this idea of a category where animals in chapter 11 must fit a particular category. In chapter 15, they must also fit a particular category. The oddity is that the category seems to be having to do with the functions of waste. For instance, both the female anatomy and the male anatomy are specifically designed to get rid of waste, to get rid of urine, to get rid of excrement, removing it from the body. And yet neither of those is clean. And yet in chapter 15, there is no discussion whatsoever of the uncleanness that comes from waste. Instead, the emphasis in chapter 15 is on other things. The uncleanness that comes from sexual function, the uncleanness that comes from the discharges of blood, the uncleanness that comes from anything other than that which actually physically makes us unclean, getting rid of waste. So again, in chapter 15, the emphasis is not on what actually makes physically unclean, but really what makes spiritually unclean. That those particular organs are supposed to fit a specific category of function, and when anything happens outside of that function, it's considered unclean. Just like with animals, outside of that particular category, it's unclean. The same with unclean skin. If the skin is not completely within the category, it's unclean. And so too here we seem to have a connection in chapter 15 with these unclean discharges. If something does not line up with the particular category that it is supposed to be a part of, it's considered unclean. And in all of these instances, because they're unclean, they either have to wash or bathe or offer sacrifices or make atonement. They cannot remain in this unclean state and approach God. They cannot participate in the sacrificial system. They cannot participate in the various festivals in Israel's calendar. The uncleanness must be dealt with first. This reminds us that there is a category in Israel that separates among those common things, not the holy things like the priests, but the commoner. There's a category of commoners who are clean and a category of commoners who are unclean. And it's only the commoner who is clean that can actually approach God in worship. In Exodus chapter 16, we deal temporarily with the Day of Atonement. Curiously, this particular festival is not at all connected with the other festivals until we get to Leviticus chapter 23. Here, it is only the Day of Atonement that is addressed. And that is potentially and most likely because in chapters 1 through 7, we've been dealing with the particular sacrifices. In chapters 11 through 15, we've been dealing with who can participate in those sacrifices. But chapter 16 in the Day of Atonement is the highest sacrifice of the year. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Day of Covering. On that 10th day of the 7th month, when all of the sins of Israel for the entire year are forgiven. Really, the daily sacrifices lead up to and lead away from this day. This is the center of Israel's calendar. This is the center of Israel's worship. First, the priest would offer a bull for himself as a sin offering, and as is done with the sin offering, he would take the blood into the holy place. Although not only would he anoint the altar of incense, he would actually put blood on the altar of incense and offer up incense in order to cover the mercy seat, so that then he could sacrifice the goat and take the blood of the goat to represent the people's sin, as well as the blood of the bull representing his own, into the most holy place, and put that blood on the mercy seat, on the covering of the Ark of the Covenant. This was only done once a year. And it was only done with one goat, even though two were appointed. One of those goats would be killed and have the blood brought into the most holy place. The other goat was given, according to the text, to Azazel. And we don't really know what Azazel is. Perhaps it's a technical term, meaning that just that particular goat was driven out into the wilderness. Some people have suggested that Azazel is a place, and that it was somewhere out in a wilderness area. Other people have suggested that Azazel was a type of demon or representative of Satan. That seems very unlikely. What we do know is that the people of Israel knew exactly what Azazel is, and they continued to drive this second goat, this scapegoat, as it's often translated traditionally, drive it out into the wilderness. What's important is that as the priest goes into the most holy place, he is headed west, and then he begins a process headed out east of anointing the various parts of the tabernacle until he finally gets all the way out east to the altar, anoints the altar, and then takes the one goat that's going to be given to Azazel, takes it east out of the tabernacle courts and releases it out into the wilderness. As Morales points out, this seems to be a recapitulation and a reenactment of what happened at the Garden of Eden, that the sin of Adam and Eve caused them to be driven out east of Eden. However, in this instance, the sin is driven east of Eden on the scapegoat. The people are actually able to then go west and to celebrate together with the priest in the courts of the tabernacle, celebrating before God. The sin has been driven out, they have been purified, they have been ransomed, they have been atoned for on this day, which allows them to go west, to go back into Eden, as it were. In chapter 17, which I'll just mention in passing, we suddenly have this complete change where we're left wondering where this came from. Several scholars have pointed out that although chapter 17 deals specifically with blood and blood sacrifices, there really seems to be a connection between the he-goat in the two goats there in chapter 16 and the he-goats that are mentioned in chapter 17. And several scholars have suggested that this is the connecting point between much of the rest of Leviticus, that there is a key word or a trigger word that occurs in certain chapters that allows the next chapters to build upon it. So chapter 17 really connects with chapter 16 based upon this one phrase, he-goats, because chapter 17 and following seems to be a response to the Day of Atonement. You've been atoned for, now you're holy, you've offered these sacrifices, you're allowed to come to the worship of God. Now how are you going to act? What does it look like to be the holy people of God? Leviticus 23 takes us to the festal calendar of Israel, transitioning away from the sacrificial system to what Israel celebrated throughout the year. There are sacrifices that are associated with each of these particular days, although oddly, those sacrifices are not listed until Numbers chapters 28 and 29. We would expect a discussion of the sacrifices to be here in Leviticus, because that's what we've been talking about for the whole book. But for whatever reason, we have to wait to the book of Numbers to find out about what is offered on each of these days. The first ceremony that's actually addressed in Leviticus 23 is the Sabbath day, which takes place on the seventh day of each week. Leviticus 23, as well as Exodus 35, give no details related to the Sabbath day or why it's supposed to be followed. Exodus chapter 20 and Exodus 31, however, tie it with creation, telling us that just as God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, we work 6 days and rest on the seventh. Although Exodus 31 also adds the extra detail that the Sabbath is a sign that God has sanctified Israel, has set them apart. It sets them apart as different. Deuteronomy, which we're not getting to in this lecture, but Deuteronomy chapter 5 also adds that the Exodus is connected to the Sabbath, that on the Sabbath day Israel reflects and remembers that God redeemed them out of Egypt. The Passover is mentioned in Leviticus 23 next because it's the first part of the year. It takes place on the 14th day of the first month and is obviously tied to the original Passover as Israel left Egypt when the angel of death passed over because of the blood of the lamb that was put on the doorposts. Israel would then continue to celebrate this each year as they commemorated that particular event. And on the next day, the 15th day of the first month, they would begin a week-long festival where they would eliminate leaven, which represented sin. They would represent also the readiness of the Israelites to leave Egypt, that their bread did not have time to rise. And yet it began to take on more of that spiritual emphasis upon eliminating leaven, eliminating sin, about being holy. It would be celebrated for 1 week beginning on that 15th day. The next festival that is given is the festival of first fruits, which is also found in Exodus 23. The festival of first fruits and the festival of weeks, which is also found in Exodus 23, called the Feast of Ingathering, These two are connected together in that they were exactly 50 days apart, but there is no beginning date that's given. We're simply told that first fruits is at the beginning of the harvest. The Festival of Weeks is at the end of the harvest, 50 days later. No date is ever given. They seem to float. It's not until the New Testament that we discover that Pentecost has become the Feast of Weeks and has a set date, 50 days after Passover. On the 7th month, the first day, trumpets were blown on the Feast of Trumpets. Again, there would be sacrifices as well, but those aren't mentioned until Numbers 28 and 29. Trumpets are blown, and it is a holy day, a Sabbath day, as the people don't do any work on that day. The Festival of Booths takes place on the 7th month, the 15th day. It lasts for 1 week. It's a very important festival in that it is during the Feast of Booths that Solomon dedicates his temple, that Haggai stands up and gives his great speech about the greater glory in the temple, and Zechariah actually foretells that in eternity all the nations will celebrate the Festival of Booths, the Festival of Tabernacles. It, out of all the festivals, is the one that is highlighted specifically by his prophecy. One of the big questions that we need to consider as we reflect upon these ceremonies, again, is what they point us to. We obviously know that the Sabbath has become the Christian Sabbath, that we celebrate it on the first day of the week because Christ rose from the dead. The Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread has become the Lord's Supper. But what do we do with first fruits and the Feast of Weeks? What do we do with the Feast of Booths and the fact that Zechariah talks about us participating in the Feast of Booths in the future? Is there a significance to the fact that the Feast of Booths is connected to the temple and that the greater glory in the temple has now come? How do we commemorate these events? Do we need to celebrate these festivals, as many people think that we do? Are we required to celebrate these festivals? What exactly does it look like for us to celebrate them in the New Testament? This is something that we will discuss more in class, but it is food for thought, even as we consider, even in this lecture, what does it look like to celebrate these in a new covenant context? Leviticus chapter 24 seems to be an excursus, kind of going off on a rabbit trail, because Leviticus 25 brings us back to the topic of festivals as we deal with the Sabbath year, the 1 year out of 7, when everybody takes a rest from farming and no longer sows and reaps the field, but simply eats what is produced. And then on the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, when all the land reverts back to the original owners, when those who are in debt are released from their debt. So Leviticus 23 is not just focused on the particular holy days within a year, but the particular holy years that take place on a cyclical basis. Leviticus 24 then seems to be a little out of place in between Leviticus 23 and 25. Leviticus 24 in the first part talks about oil for the lamps and the bread that is made from the grain offerings that goes into the tabernacle and sits on the table of showbread for the particular priests to eat in the presence of God. We'll kind of question why this chapter is here and not closer to earlier portions of the book of Leviticus when we dealt with grain offerings. Perhaps some of it is revealed by the fact that there is a discussion of the death penalty, somewhat of a foreboding placement here in Leviticus chapter 23. Those who blaspheme are put to death. Those who murder are put to death. Which makes us wonder if we're supposed to understand the seriousness of these festivals. That is, God has continued to say that somebody is cut off if they are unclean and can't participate in the ceremonies, if they are cut off because they refuse to participate in the ceremonies. Is Leviticus 24 supposed to get us to reflect upon the fact that this is so serious that a death penalty needs to be discussed in the context of festivals? That seems to be likely. That God is trying to get us to understand how important this is to him and how seriously he takes it when the Israelites refuse to obey and follow the ceremonies that have been established for them, including the Sabbath year, including the year of Jubilee. We very rarely hear about those ever being celebrated, and it seems as though Israel simply skipped them. So perhaps they did not quite pick up on the hint of foreboding placement with the discussion of the death penalty right in the middle of all these ceremonies. Something for us to reflect upon as we consider the ceremonies of baptism and the Lord's Supper in the New Testament and the ongoing ceremony of worship. Is it possible that we take our church attendance a little bit too lightly when God considers here in the Old Testament that it's appropriate to talk about the death penalty alongside the festal calendar? Exodus chapter 28 tells us of the creation of the garments for the high priests and all the other priests. We're told that there are 12 stones that are placed in the breastplate of the high priest, in the ephod as it's sometimes referred to. There are 2 stones that are also set in the shoulder. All 12 stones each individually carry a name of one of the tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel. 2 of the stones that are set in the shoulder each have 6 names on them, in order to be carried as a remembrance before the Lord. We're also told that in the breastplate is the Urim and the Thummim that are used for casting lots. We don't really know how this worked, but it was a way that the person who was using the ephod could actually communicate with God, perhaps by asking questions, yes or no questions. Perhaps one represented yes, one represented no. We don't really know. We just simply know that the Urim and the Thummim were used for that purpose, to ascertain the will of God. Aaron specifically has a nameplate on his turban that says "Holy to the Lord." He's the only one that has this, although all of the priests are considered holy to the Lord, but it's especially the high priest that bears this name. He also has bells on his blue robe, bells and pomegranates, that are supposed to carry him before the Ark of the Covenant when he goes in on that Day of Atonement, or perhaps even when he goes into the holy place to trim the lamps. There's a number of different reasons why this may be. Some have suggested that it was so if he dropped dead, people on the outside of the tabernacle would know because of the lack of music that he was dead and that they could somehow go in and retrieve the body. It's also possible simply that this is the way that God wanted it, and that he wanted this noise of Aaron walking before the Ark of the Covenant. Again, we're not really given specific instructions as to why, other than that it's supposed to be a remembrance before God. All the priests, including the high priests, have garments for glory and beauty. These are unusual pairing of words because beauty doesn't occur that many times, but it is compared here with glory, and so we know that it carries a similar idea. These are supposed to be representative of the glory that are carried by these priests, their glorious job, the representing of God's glory before the people, but also the representing of the people before God. And of course, all the priests are supposed to wear special underwear, which is where the Mormons get this idea of special underwear for all of their church members. Here, the priests and the high priests are supposed to wear undergarments, both when they go up on the altar, so that their nakedness is not seen, but apparently at all times they're supposed to wear these particular undergarments, so that they are clean before God and not defiling by allowing their nakedness to be seen, which was greatly frowned upon in Israel. Exodus chapter 29 lays out for us the ordination process for priests and the high priest. They are to take one bull as a sin offering, like for a leader, where the blood is not taken into the tabernacle, but used to anoint the horns of the altar. It is also offered for 7 days, not just once. 2 rams are used at the beginning of the ordination process, one for a complete burnt offering. The other has its blood placed on the priest's right toe, thumb, and ear, just like those who are cleansed of leprosy, as well as the garments. We're also told that the right thigh, which is typically reserved for the priest, is here burned as God's portion. The right breast is waved and given to Moses, who is the one performing this ceremony, but then the right breast will be Aaron's in perpetuity, and the rest of the ram is to be boiled and eaten at the entrance to the tent of meeting. They are also to take cakes and unleavened bread, one of which is going to be burned, one is going to be eaten. And then they are actually anointed with oil, separating them, along with the blood that's on the garments, from the rest of Israel. They will, in perpetuity, carry this anointing oil on them, on their garments. Their garments will be completely stained for all time, and they will be covered in blood for all time. Exodus 29 also ends by telling us a little bit more about the perpetual offerings that are offered at the tabernacle. There is a grain offering that is to be offered every day, as well as a lamb that is offered in the morning as a burnt offering and in the evening for a burnt offering, to continue to purify the altar and the tent. We are reminded that they are sanctified by my glory. It is God's glory itself that sets the tabernacle apart. Not just this process of purifying it through blood, although that certainly plays a part, but ultimately it is God's glory that sets the tabernacle apart and makes it holy. Up to this point, we expect that there was going to be a priesthood, and yet Exodus 19 said that Israel was going to be a kingdom of priests. In Exodus chapter 32, though, we have the incident of the golden calf, and when Moses returns from the mountain, he asks who stands with him, and all the Levites rally to him. At that point, it is said that the Levites have been selected as the priestly tribe, and that they will take the place of all the firstborn in Israel. So in Leviticus chapters 8 and 9, the line of Aaron is actually ordained. We see the ordination taking place in chapter 8, but then we see Aaron beginning to offer sacrifices in chapter 9. And so even though Moses has been the one receiving the instructions and initially offering these offerings in the ordination of the priests, there's a transition in Leviticus chapter 9 to Aaron. Aaron is now the one who is the high priest. Aaron's line will continue to be priests in perpetuity, forever. As long as Israel continues, Aaron and his line will be priests. Again, this is a somewhat unexpected turn, even though we have the ordination service explained for us in Exodus chapter 29, and even though we're told about the priesthood in Exodus 27 and 28, we still wonder who exactly is going to be the priests. Is it just going to be all of Israel? Is it going to be the young men as it was in Exodus chapter 24? But here we find out, no, because of the incident with the golden calf, it is going to be the Levites. The Levites in the line of Aaron are going to be the priests and those who work at the tabernacle. The final mention of priests in the book of Leviticus is in chapters 21 and 22, where the book lays out the holiness regulations for priests. There are specific requirements for priests, things that they cannot do. The high priest especially is not allowed to leave the tabernacle courts at all, whether for the death of a loved one or for the death of a close relative, whereas a normal priest can, depending on who the relative is. There's also marriage regulations. Not only can they only marry from the line of Aaron, they can also never marry somebody outside of the Levites. This is strictly forbidden. It's curious that when we get to the New Testament, we see Zechariah, the priest, married apparently to somebody in the line of Judah, since Elizabeth is somehow Mary's relative, and Mary is from the line of Judah. How this happened, we don't know, but apparently over time, the people no longer followed these explicit instructions to make sure that the priests are marrying from a priestly family. They also can't marry widows or those who have been divorced. Because the priests represent God before the people and carry the people in remembrance before God, they have specific requirements, specific standards of holiness that they must follow. I've already mentioned that Numbers chapters 1 through 9 tell us a lot about the arrangement of the people. There's a census, there's a discussion of the camp, there's a discussion of how the priests and the Levites are supposed to lead the people when they're marching, and what order they're going to march in. But really, Numbers 1 through 9 deal a lot with the Levites. Perhaps, as some scholars have suggested, it is trying to explain that all Israel, again, is supposed to be like the priests and follow this behavior. But it does seem as though the emphasis is largely upon the Levites. So in Numbers chapter 3, we have an emphasis, again from Exodus 32, in the incident with the golden calf, of the tax that is given to redeem the firstborn. The Levites all represent the firstborn, and in all of those particular instances where there are more firstborn than there are Levites, or vice versa, there is supposed to be a tax that is paid to cover the extras. It's interesting that these numbers don't really work in Numbers chapter 3, because in order for there to have been that many firstborn, there would have to be somewhere around 20 children per family. There simply aren't enough firstborn that are listed, or there's simply too many Levites that are listed. But for whatever reason, the numbers don't quite work the way that we would expect, and there isn't really an interpretation for how this works. This is one of the unusual parts of the book of Numbers, especially with the censuses that take place at the beginning of the book. The numbers are very hard to explain. How do you get 1 million people to wander around the wilderness and have bread and have water? Yes, miraculously, but how do you actually physically go about getting the water from Mount Sinai and from the brook? How do you actually get it to the people when there's 1 million of them? How do you get that many people to march and to get up and rise at the same day? It would take multiple days even for 1 million people to leave the territory of Egypt. So how do these numbers work? We don't know. Lots of theories have been suggested, but none of them are satisfactory. There simply are some very unusual numbers that require us to understand them as miraculous. That somehow God managed to lead 1 million people through the wilderness, which is certainly within God's power. We certainly don't doubt that. But logistically, it is difficult to wrap our minds around. And this is the case with the firstborn and the Levites. There simply aren't enough firstborn to cover all the Levites, hence the tax. But we wonder, there's 11 tribes, technically 12 tribes if you include the 2 half-tribes of Joseph. How are there not enough firstborn? Or how are there not more firstborn than Levites? How are there so few firstborn? We don't really know. But what we do know is that God is again emphasizing that redeeming of the firstborn from Exodus chapter 32. It hasn't been forgotten. It is taking place here. In Numbers chapter 5, there is an emphasis on cleanness, talking about a person who is unclean, talking about making restitution if something has been taken that wasn't supposed to be taken, or if some of the articles that were holy are accidentally taken by some of the people. And there's this weird testing of women at the end of Numbers chapter 5, where a woman will actually drink what amounts to a particular type of potion that is supposed to make her either not able to bear children or is supposed to vindicate her when nothing happens. This is when her husband accuses her of committing some sin of adultery. Many scholars have suggested that this is a way to protect women from the jealousy of their husband because it doesn't actually hurt them. So it's not really a trial by pain or suffering because the pain or suffering doesn't happen unless they are guilty. Whereas in a lot of instances in other religions, the pain or the suffering takes place no matter what, such as being thrown in a river. And if they drown, then they were guilty. And if they somehow manage to swim, then they are innocent. But in this case, there is no harm or even potential harm to the woman unless she is guilty, in which case she simply won't be able to have children. And yet, adultery is often used as a stand-in for idolatry. And so as we consider this testing of women, especially where it falls within the discussion of the Levites and everything else going on with the sacrificial system and the tabernacle and where the Levites are supposed to be and protecting the people from the glory of God, we begin to wonder if maybe this isn't so much about testing a woman as much as it is about the adultery of Israel, since we don't actually read anywhere in the Old Testament of this particular ceremony being performed, just simply an explanation of it. Another emphasis of the fact that Israel needs to be clean and holy to approach God, and a way to make sure that that is indeed the case. In Numbers chapter 6, we read about the Nazirite vow, and that is followed up with the Aaronic blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. And yet that seems to come at the end of Numbers chapter 6, as though everything that has come before has something to do with Aaron, has something to do with the line of priests, almost as though the Nazirite vow is a way for non-priests to act like priests, to be consecrated to God, dedicated to God, which is what Nazar from Nazarite means, to be consecrated to God, that this is a way for this kingdom of priests to act like priests and to follow some of the rules and regulations, and even more strict rules and regulations than priests, not drinking wine, not cutting their hair, etc., perhaps for their whole life, perhaps just for a time, but it seems to be a way for them to dedicate themselves like the priests, as though they are set apart specifically for God. And then at the end we have this Aaronic blessing that kind of sums up that whole section. This is the blessing that comes upon Israel when they do what God has called them to do, when they are clean, when they are free from idolatry, when they are free from adultery, when they are dedicated to God. In Numbers chapter 8, there is discussion about Levites being ordained, all the Levites being ordained, not just the line of Aaron at this point, but what do we do when we ordain any of the Levites, as well as retirement. Reminder that priests only work from 25 to 50, and that once they hit 50, they retire. They can guard at the tabernacle, but they no longer serve at the tabernacle. And so again, we have details about the Levites, here wrapping up a section as though this is a continuation of the book of Leviticus. But Leviticus is specifically upon the sacrificial system. Really, Numbers 1 through 9 seem to be more geared around the tabernacle, the actual administrative details. Who can approach it? Who interacts with it? How can all of Israel act like priests in this kingdom of priests? And so it is a great summary then at the end, here at the beginning of Numbers chapter 9, at the end of this first section of Numbers, for the Passover to be celebrated, for this to be the culmination of these chapters, celebrating in worship, celebrating what God has done in delivering them out of Egypt and preparing them then to go into the promised land. Although, as we already saw in our first lecture, they don't go into the promised land the first try, but it at least gives an opportunity for them to spiritually prepare for that event, as though they were going to be successful in believing God and entering into the promised land. Well, this brings us to the end of this particular lecture. This has been a lot of information. This has been a lot of detail on the tabernacle and the priests and the theology of it. This should give us some lively material for conversation and discussion as we come to it in our next class.